Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by
the Bartlett Area Chamber of Commerce and its member, First Tennessee, serving our Mid-South community with financial services for over 150 years, offering innovative products and services that provide value and convenience throughout your life and the life of your business.
The WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
New efforts to tackle blight in Memphis tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by June West from Memphis Heritage. Thanks for being here again.
Thanks for asking.
Brandon Gator with Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Rashawn Austin, Vice Chair of the newly formed Blight Authority of Memphis. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And Bill Dries, Senior Reporter with the Memphis Daily News. So let's start. The Blight Authority of Memphis was formed late last year. You're Vice Chair of the board. What is the Blight Authority and what's its mission?
So the Blight Authority is officially a land bank, and I know you throw around words a lot, and so people say we already had a Shelby County land bank,
right?
But not really. And so we're a real land bank, similar to what you see in other cities and counties across the U.S. And so, as a part of this blight fight in Memphis and Shelby County, our board has the ability to basically be a receiver of land and hold that land tax-free for developers to get that land and actually do development. So it's a little different where developers will have to develop the land. They won't be able to just pick up land from what was the Shelby County Land Bank and hold on to it.
This doesn't replace the Shelby County Land Bank, correct?
It does not replace the Shelby County Land Bank. We're actually partnering with the Shelby County Land Bank, and they were pro the formation of the Blight Authority of Memphis.
And because they take properties that are foreclosed on for non-payment of taxes.
That's
that
right.
Correct? And then have to hold them for a period of time before somebody can come back and say, well, I want my property back, I'm going to pay the taxes now. So a whole more hoops and hurdles versus a more streamlined effort.
Yes, and then they don't have the teeth where after a person picks up that property for whatever amount they pick it up to actually enforce development of that property. Okay. And so the person could hold it, it could go back into a tax delinquent state.
Right.
And ideally, our board wouldn't allow that, and we would cause development to happen.
Okay, we'll come back to more of that, but Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. has been around since 2012, is that correct?
That's correct.
Tell me what it does and how it works in hand, I think, with groups like Blight Authority.
Sure. So Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. started in 2012 on the basis that, the geographic footprint of Memphis has been expanding since 1970. Since 1970, it's expanded about 55%, while the population only grew 4%. So this has given us a lot of challenges when it comes to property and a huge divestment from the internal core. This has presented problems significantly within low-income, moderate-income areas where children have to walk past these intractable properties, these vacant, abandoned, open for casual entry, crime nuisance properties. So seeing this, there was no strategy that the city had or the private sector had on really remediating this problem that we have. So Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. came in as a nonprofit that could do what the government couldn't do for lack of capacity and what the private sector wouldn't do for a lack of return on investment. And that included taking title to land and being able to do something with it in partnership with adjacent property owners. And the way that we work with Blight Authority of Memphis, we were actually the advocates for the resolution and the formation of the Blight Authority of Memphis. Right. So, and we'll be going forward. So Sheila Jordan Cunningham, who was a lawyer for Brewer Barlow, is now the executive director of the Blight Authority of Memphis. And
Steve Barlow's been on the show a number of times. I mean, he's kind of the quiet hero of a lot of people who fight blight and has been working over many years to help solve this problem, but has lacked, in Steve's very polite way, has said he's kind of lacked the tools, and that these things are the beginning of those tools that people need to take care of this. June, how long have you been at Memphis Heritage?
14 years.
This kind of stuff must make you really happy.
It really does. I mean, I think it's an act moving in the right direction. There has been a lot of focus on commercial buildings lately with this group, which I know so many people, because those are so dangerous and such an issue for our community. But I've worked with Steve years years before and watched him in action, because he's actually responsible for getting the Historic Neighborhood Act put together and passed in Nashville, because this had to be approved on that level before it could move in this direction. And Steve actually, when he first started this program, we would talk about houses that were in decent neighborhoods but were causing problems, and what could we see or work on to help save that property. So in some cases, in 90% of the cases, what the buildings they're talking about need to go down. They need to be demolished. The person owning it, or through this BAM, they need to be responsible for redeveloping it, not just making it be a blatant, because a lot's just as dangerous in some ways if it's not cut as a vacant house. So I think this puts teeth in it, and it also allows for us to think about other options for blighted property that might be salvageable, i.e. Habitat for Humanity coming in and perhaps restructuring and reusing a property that's got good bones, so that that neighborhood does not lose its architectural integrity 100%. You know what was built there at a certain era.
Yeah, Bill.
Rashawn, is the Blight Authority eligible for some of the Tennessee Housing Development Authority money that we heard about earlier? I think probably last year, THDA came in and talked about that some.
So based on the rules, it appears that we're eligible, and actually we have a couple of meetings with the executive director of THDA within the next week to really lay that out, because I don't know if when those funds became available, that of course they weren't thinking about an entity that did not exist. And so they may have to make some adjustments to their rules to accommodate this new entity. So ideally, I think they were only talking about the nonprofit developers with whom they were already familiar and they have history with in terms of funding. And so we do have conversations with Ralph Perry upcoming to determine how the Blight Authority in Memphis can receive those funds.
Right, because the THDA's intent at the outset was to go beyond just clearing a lot. That Ralph in particular was very interested in the next step beyond that, and that is filling in a gap in a residential neighborhood where there is a new house there, as opposed to just having a lot there. June, has the problem here been that we didn't have the right regulations, the right laws in place to do what we wanted to do with blight?
I believe so. When the Neighborhood Historic Preservation Act was passed, it allowed for receiverships and it allowed for people to step in. It was still clumsy in the sense that we were going through the regular tax system and the Shelby County. I'm not sure it would really connect with the Shelby County Land Bank, because sometimes this brings in environmental court, which we haven't touched on, but that was the mode where things had to happen. And they probably still have to somewhat go through that system. But there was never an answer. It was either or. The family couldn't prevent the house from being condemned. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the wherewithal, or they just didn't care, or it was abandoned. And so the sticky wicket here is trying to get that process through environmental court quickly enough with an answer at the end, not just status quo every hearing. So I really do think this puts makes it more expedient to look at alternatives and having solutions to these properties.
And is environmental court basically is a once every 6 month check-in?
No, it's a once every month.
Once every month.
If you're in environmental court and have a case, yes.
If you're the property owner, you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
And anyone, like we monitor buildings that are historic, and so we have to attend those meetings every month on that building, or whichever buildings we're looking at, and because we want to come up with alternatives. Our goal at Memphis Heritage is we can't save every building, we shouldn't, but we need to try to be there to connect people and entities to be able to perhaps save that historic home.
Yeah.
So Brandon, how do you get someone to go the next step to develop the property once they have it, and follow up with it in a reasonable time frame, because we're still talking about having the financing to do that?
Right. So at environmental court, Steve Barlow is pretty much the main litigator on behalf of the city of Memphis. And there's as far as development goes, we would just like, as a city, for people to keep their properties up to a certain standard, being compliant with the code here, with code enforcement. So this is the most intractable things like falling roofs, being open to casual entry. So just simply boarding up or fixing the fascia boards might be enough to get the case dismissed. But as far as redevelopment, like you said, there's still a finance. It always comes down to the money. But luckily, Steve Barlow has done over 1,000 cases at environmental court, with about 650 being dismissed. So that means that they have come to some kind of agreement or resolution in environmental court. So it is a great vehicle for remediating these problems.
Are these owners mostly people who live here, or are they people who have bought investment property who live in other places far away from here?
It's a mix of both. Definitely the ones here at home are a bit easier to serve and to deal with. But in cases of ownership from, let's say, people that have passed away, but they have heirs, so it's hard to serve all of their particular heirs or siblings and such. The ones out of town, of course, are very hard to reach, and it's hard to get them inside of court. But and in that case, that's where the receivership process actually becomes pretty available. We've been working to lower the redemption period, which is the time in which an owner can come back and say, hey, no, that's my property. By that time, they have to pay the first lien on the property are the remediations and rehabilitations that have been done by whoever the court-appointed receiver was.
Right, and that's a sliding scale, as I understand it, because I think we've already had one tax sale that used the new redemption period. So the longer the taxes are owed, the shorter the period is. In some cases, 30 days.
Correct.
Because it used to be, I didn't realize this for a long time. We've done shows on this. If you bought a property out of a tax sale, you think you'd have it, but you really had to wait a year because the person could come back on the 364th day and say, no, I want that back. And so that was part of, you were talking about, some of the problems. It's just the way the law was set up with the land bank, and maybe that, property rights are an important issue, but it made developers not very interested in coming in there and waiting for a year and maybe losing. It just was a messy sort of process. David Lenore has pushed for that change. And so on.
It's a nonprofit developer. I was just thinking of real life examples of why we couldn't develop properties, because most likely the private sector is not going to necessarily come in with our small lots and all of our issues in the inner city. Well, you have nonprofit developers very often who are there. That's where they develop. Right. But if there is a property that's tax delinquent and it was on the city side prior to the trustee taking over that process, it may go 10 years. Then I can't afford to pay the taxes and hold the property and pay the property tax ongoing and cut the lawn and develop it in terms of financing. There was never enough money to develop that particular property, and then wait on the redemption period to end. And so it was just too costly. And so it's going to sit vacant because I can't do it.
And you had developers and individuals that didn't want to take that long. I mean, they might want to, they could satisfy what the needs were via environmental court. They could warehouse it, they could protect it where no one could get in it, or plus that, they could go in and restore it. And then with the receivership, that comes in front of taxes, okay? So the lien is on whoever took that responsibility as a receivership to do that, plus 10%.
Yeah.
So it's like New Orleans does the same thing, except individuals can declare property blight, which is very interesting. They can go to the courts and say, I'm saying that this property is blighted and I want to do this to it.
Right.
Ours is a little more complicated, but it's still moving in that direction.
Yeah. So let's put you on the spot. I mean, about how many properties are you all targeting? I mean, how many properties are we talking about in the city of Memphis or Shelby County?
As far as vacant and abandoned?
Yeah, that would fall into some sort of effort either through your group or you guys have identified, or let's quantify this.
We've identified over 35,000 parcels of land in the city of Memphis that are more than 3 years delinquent on taxes.
Okay.
So that's a huge number. About 4,500 of those are now owned by Shelby County Land Bank. So these are properties that have gone through tax sale and no one bid upon them. Okay. And by default, they go to Shelby County Land Bank. Currently, Shelby County spends about $8 million just mowing grass.
Yeah.
These are significant amounts that could be spent elsewhere if we had more vehicles like the Blight Authority of Memphis that could aggregate parcels together, that could hold developers accountable on a compliance scale,
Right.
And bring a bulk action to quiet title.
Yeah, who will fund? Who funds the Blight Authority? I mean, how we talked a little bit about the Tennessee, you know, the possibility of funds through the Tennessee Housing Development Agency. But is it private donations or is it city funded?
Right now,
or is
it's philanthropy, so it's mainly private donations that are funding us in our very beginning stages, and so we don't have any outside sources outside of what was brought
Right.
to us through the Neighborhood Preservation
Right.
Act.
Okay. And same. You're an independent nonprofit?
Yes.
Funded by the city or no?
All foundation money.
All
Private
foundation money.
money.
So how does this work? These efforts work with the community development corporations. So, Fraser Community Development. We've had Steve Lockwood on before. I think he's real happy about this kind of thing, right? Because he sees these blighted properties in Fraser, and he hadn't been able to get his hands on them. And because of all the complications, I assume you'll be working closely with the community
We'll
development.
be working closely. I'm actually an executive director of a community development corporation
Okay.
in my day life.
I walked right into that. I think you told me that before the show, but
And so, yes, they were very engaged as a part of this conversation, the policy committee of the Community
Right.
Development Council. And so the executive directors and the staffs of those organizations were a part of this conversation. Probably, Steve and I have probably been working together for the last 21 years.
Yeah.
And so we've all been a part of that conversation ongoing, and we finally got to something that we could use so that we can better develop properties, make this process much easier for us in the neighborhoods where we're working.
The
go ahead.
the CD Council with Emily Trenholm was actually the first partner with Neighborhood Preservation Inc. So at the policy committee, I was actually on that committee with a woman named Amy Shaflin from United Housing, and we were looking at Bill Tracker online as far as the Tennessee State Legislature, and we saw this interesting bill titled the Oak Ridge Land Bank Pilot. And then it all of a sudden became open, I think in 14, to home rule municipalities. And so we thought, well, there's something that we could do here in Memphis. We could have a new vehicle for dealing with blighted property. And Emily really took that and championed it, and I think provided the first amount of funding
She did.
For Sheila Jordan Cunningham, who's now executive director, to really research this topic and see the best practices across the nation for land banking.
Yeah, Phil.
So, working with the Community Development Corporation, what is the key to getting someone to build on a lot? Is this a smaller scale work in terms of filling in gaps in a neighborhood that only a nonprofit could take on, or is there a real possibility of private developers looking at it on a lot by lot basis, kind of in a checkerboard fashion?
There's the possibility that we can incent private development. So what's been the problem with private development coming into inner city neighborhoods where you have a significant amount of blight? And again, I say we have these small lots, and generally private developers build subdivisions because they have to look at return on investment. We've been blessed with subsidy, typically some kind of federal pass-through entitlement funds CDCs can use to do our work. They don't have that. And so if CDCs, we don't have the capacity necessarily to build subdivisions, but if we can kind of go in and incent and not prevent them from doing it. So if the laws are all around preventing them from doing it, no, they're not going to come in because they're going to go into a deficit. And I don't think they're that philanthropic to go into deficits to do development. It just doesn't make sense. They can't keep their doors open if that's how they operate. And we're barely keeping our doors open, but we have the blessing of subsidy generally to do that. It's a lot less now since entitlement funds have been cut significantly. It's not the 90s anymore. We had a lot more in entitlement funds, but we still have some subsidy and we have some incentives that we can partner with private development. That's where you have these public-private partnerships or public-private nonprofit partnerships to incent private development in. So if I go in and I'm the first one in and we find enough land on one street, and that may happen because we have whole blighted streets and whole sections of neighborhoods that are blighted, where I can come in and use my subsidy in partnership with a private developer because they're better at it, honestly. This is what they do every day, all day. We do a bit of everything in our neighborhoods, but they're developers. And if I can privately or partner with them to make the neighborhood better or make a street better or make that section of the neighborhood better, both residential and commercial properties, multifamily are really big in some neighborhoods more than others. A lot of our older neighborhoods don't have a lot of multifamily development. But it's mostly single-family detached and deteriorated commercial corridors. And so if we can partner with them and use our subsidies in a better way or smarter way, I don't know if we've always used our subsidies smartly. Maybe we didn't know how to, maybe we were unwilling to, or maybe we just weren't having those conversations with private developers. And I always use this thing about a farm because we have a farmer's market. So I said it takes a lot of different people on a farm to make it operate. There's the person that plows the ground, there's the person that puts in the seed, there's the person that picks the crop, and then they take that crop and they take it either to market or they produce some kind of other product like a salad dressing or something from the tomatoes. And so all of us have a role to play, and maybe I'm only the person that seeds the ground or I plow the ground and someone else comes in, but it's still the same farm and we all have the same end product that we're trying to accomplish. And so maybe it's a conversation that we can start to have better with private developers and how we redevelop. We can't do it alone. They can't do it, we can't do it.
Because you talked about the 90s, just in the 20 years since the 1990s, I think what we expect of neighborhoods and what we expect neighborhoods to do has changed pretty dramatically. It used to be that we viewed neighborhood as exclusively residential areas. Now we have mixed use development in so many neighborhoods. And so neighborhoods that start out with the small lots that we have now, which weren't so small when those houses were built, that's a problem. So it seems to me that kind of the palette you're working on continues to change over time in terms of what neighborhoods do and how they function.
I have an idealistic concept of, because once I first talked to Steve and I heard, listen, this could take out whole blocks and things like that, I'm thinking, we're going to make another little Cooper Young. We're going to make another little mixed-use residential program where you've got little shops, like I've forgotten the name of the neighborhood that's north of Walnut Grove that, they have their own little...
High Point.
High Point Terrace, and I mean those kind of things. That's what I'm talking about. Like it's like building a little community, because I think what we're all seeing is that's what people want. They want to be able to walk and get what they need, not necessarily not have a car, but be able to have that convenience, and with this kind of clearing of land.
Right. But so sometimes Memphis Heritage, sometimes you are criticized that you're opposed to, any tearing down of any building. So that balancing act from your point of view, I mean, Memphis Heritage has fought hard for all kinds of buildings, all kinds of historic structures, but you're here saying sometimes buildings have to come down, sometimes homes. How do you balance that?
Absolutely. I was a developer before I took over Memphis Heritage, so
you've torn some things down.
Yeah, I know. I actually built things in neighborhoods that were a little problematic sometime when I was trying to get them in there, but you learn through that process, and it's community relationships.
Right.
It's dealing and asking the community, what do you want, and making sure that you've gotten them invested in it. So no, our critics are wonderful. I mean, I
think that's the first time I've heard that.
Well, because they help other people understand that we're not just about tear down, we're about creative solutions to inner city blight as well as redevelopment.
There is a bit of not to overdo it, but there's kind of this renaissance in Memphis about historic structures in blighted areas. I mean, from Crosstown to Overton Square, the brewery downtown, and all parts of down Chisca, which, and finally the 107 Main, who only people who are wonky like us know what that is, but it's one of the last bad properties down on Main Street that's changed hands now. Is some of this about just economic growth? Because as you're saying, I mean, at some point, it really is private money that has to take care of this. And do you see sort of some momentum happening with these historic projects, not only being redone, and then the whole neighborhood begins to kind of expand?
Yes.
So
it's been a remarkable transition in my 14 years just to see what happened, with, Overton Square is phenomenal. I mean, no one thought it would take off that quickly after being saved when all buildings should have been razed according to the previous owner. So it is, we are on a renaissance of, I think it has to do with not only developers seeing the benefits of it and also having some incentives, but also the generations that are coming on board want authenticity. They want things to be real, not made up. And, I mean, I don't mean Germantown Road's made up, but where else would you, see that kind of thing? That's unfortunate. But they want this collectiveness and this neighborhoodness, if you will. And I think through this program, it will do wonders in the community.
Right.
And I think that, Memphis, as far as this renaissance that we're speaking of, as far as the public sector, the private sector, and not-for-profits, we've all been unified by a common enemy, and that's blight, vacancy, and abandonment. So our needs are now intersecting, our wants are now aligned, and that provides the opportunity for like Rashun was saying.
And businessmen are making profits.
Right, and their profits, but it's really through the intersection of partnerships.
Right.
So it's balancing our opportunity costs. There's limitations that government has. So if someone is an environmental court and they say, I don't want this property, I have title to it, but I want to leave it. I want to donate it to the city of Memphis, or I want to donate it to Shelby County. Currently, the Shelby County can't take that property. City of Memphis can't take that property. The Blight Authority of Memphis can take that property and can also hold, like I said earlier, developers accountable for future development plans.
The nonprofit can't afford to take that property.
Right.
Right. All right. Well, we will leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week.
Support for Behind the Headlines is provided in part by the Bartlett Area Chamber of Commerce and its member First Tennessee, serving our Mid-South community with financial services for over 150 years, offering innovative products and services that provide value and convenience throughout your life and the life of your business.